The old wooden sign creaked gently in the cool night breeze, hanging precariously above the entrance of St. Mary's Baptist Church. Nestled at the edge of a small southern town, the church stood as a beacon of hope, faith, and resilience for the local Black community. It had survived decades of storms, both literal and metaphorical, but tonight, an ominous tension seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the summer humidity. Inside, the congregation was wrapping up their midweek service. The warm glow of candles flickered across the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the wooden pews. Families sat together, their voices lifting in a harmonious hymn that spoke of deliverance and unity. The atmosphere was one of peace, a sanctuary from the world outside. But not everyone in the room was there for worship. At the back of the church, in a shadowed corner, sat a man who didn't quite belong. His name was Marcus Kane, though few would have guessed it from his unassuming demeanor. Dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, he blended into the crowd, an anonymous face among many. But Marcus was no ordinary churchgoer. A decorated Army Ranger who had spent years on the front lines of some of the most dangerous missions overseas, he carried a quiet intensity. His eyes, sharp and alert, scanned the room constantly, as though he were expecting trouble. Marcus had come to St. Mary's that evening not for faith, but for solitude. After leaving the military, he had struggled to find his place in the civilian world. Cities felt too chaotic, and the countryside, though quieter, carried its own share of challenges. He had drifted into this town a few weeks ago, drawn by the kindness of the people and the simple charm of life here. But even as he tried to settle, a part of him remained on edge, always ready for the next threat. Unbeknownst to Marcus or anyone else inside the church, trouble was already on its way. On the outskirts of town, headlights cut through the darkness as a group of trucks roared down the narrow dirt road leading to St. Mary's. Inside the vehicles sat a group of men, their faces hardened with hatred and ignorance. They called themselves the Crimson Vultures, a local gang notorious for their acts of intimidation and violence. Their leader, a man named Roy Hatcher, had a grudge against the church, though no one quite knew why. Tonight, he intended to make a statement. In the lead truck, Roy lit a cigarette, his lips curling into a smirk. "Let's give them something to pray about," he drawled, earning a chorus of laughs from his crew. In the back of the truck, crates of spray paint, chains, and other tools of destruction rattled with each bump in the road. It was clear they were gearing up for more than just graffiti. Back inside the church, the hymn ended, and the pastor began his closing prayer. Marcus bowed his head out of respect, though his mind was elsewhere. Something didn't feel right. The faint hum of engines reached his ears, growing louder by the second. His instincts, honed through years of combat, kicked in. He straightened in his seat, his muscles tensing. As the trucks pulled up just beyond the churchyard, the gang killed their engines. The sudden silence was eerie, broken only by the sound of boots hitting the gravel. Roy gestured for his men to spread out, his confidence unshaken by the possibility of resistance. After all, what could a congregation of churchgoers do against a gang like his? Marcus's eyes flicked to the windows as he caught the movement of shadows outside. His heartbeat quickened, but his expression remained calm. He had seen this kind of scenario before, innocent people caught in the crosshairs of evil. Without a word, he rose from his seat and moved quietly toward the back of the church, his every step deliberate. The first bang shattered the tranquility, the sound of a heavy object slamming against the front door. Gasps rippled through the congregation as heads turned toward the noise. The pastor paused mid-sentence, his face pale but resolute. "Stay calm, everyone," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. "We are in God's house." Marcus knew better than to wait for divine intervention. He reached the back exit and stepped outside, disappearing into the shadows. Years of training had taught him to operate silently and efficiently, and tonight would be no different. He had no weapons, no backup, and no plan. But he had his skills, and that would have to be enough. As Roy and his men began their assault on the church, they remained blissfully unaware of the predator lurking in the darkness. Marcus Kane wasn't just a man seeking peace, he was a warrior who knew how to protect it. And tonight, The Crimson Vultures were about to learn that they had chosen the wrong target. The night air was thick with tension as Marcus moved through the shadows, his movements silent and precise. The faint rustle of leaves underfoot was the only sound he made as he circled around the side of the church. From his position, he could see the gang gathering near the front steps, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of the flashlight. They were loud, confident, and completely unaware of his presence. Roy Hatcher barked orders to his crew, his voice low but laced with authority. "Keep it quiet until I say otherwise. We don't need the whole town showing up." He gestured toward two younger men in the group, who carried cans of spray paint. "Start with the walls. I want them to see who did this." The younger men nodded and hurried toward the side of the church, their laughter muted but still audible. They began shaking the cans, the metallic rattle breaking the stillness of the night. Marcus watched them carefully, his mind racing. He could already feel the adrenaline coursing through him, but he forced himself to remain calm. Acting too soon could jeopardize everything. Inside the church, the congregation had fallen into an uneasy silence. The pastor tried to reassure everyone, but the tension was palpable. Mothers clutched their children tightly, and elderly members exchanged worried glances. Some whispered prayers under their breath, their voices trembling. No one knew exactly what was happening outside, but the sense of impending danger was impossible to ignore. Marcus moved closer to the two men with the spray paint, staying low and out of sight. He could hear their conversation now, their words dripping with arrogance. "Man, this place is too easy," one of them said, shaking his head as he started tagging the wall with crude symbols. "Yeah," the other replied, his voice tinged with excitement. "Hatcher's got this whole town scared. Ain't nobody gonna mess with us." Marcus clenched his fists, but he didn't make a move. Not yet. He needed to gather more information, figure out how many men he was dealing with and what their intentions were. He could handle a fight, but charging in blindly wasn't an option. Back at the front of the church, Roy was inspecting the heavy chains and padlocks his crew had brought with them. "Once we're done here, we lock it up tight," he said, his tone cold and calculated. "Make sure they know they're not welcome." One of the older gang members, a burly man with a scruffy beard, hesitated. "You sure this is a good idea, Roy? I mean, it's just a church." Roy turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "It's not about the church. It's about sending a message. They think they can just live here, worship here, like nothing's changed. Not on my watch." The burly man didn't argue further, but his unease was clear. Roy's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of misplaced anger and hatred. Marcus listened from the shadows, his jaw tightening. He'd seen men like Roy before, bullies who thrived on fear and division. They always thought they were in control, until someone stood up to them. As the gang continued their work, Marcus began to formulate a plan. He needed to act quickly and decisively, but he also had to ensure the safety of the people inside the church. He couldn't risk escalating the situation and putting innocent lives in danger. He slipped around to the back of the church, where an old storage shed stood. The door was unlocked, and Marcus eased it open, stepping inside. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, scanning the space for anything he could use. His hands found a length of sturdy rope and an old wooden plank, worn but solid. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Outside, the gang was growing bolder. The spray-painted symbols on the walls were joined by crude slurs, and the sound of breaking glass echoed through the night as one of the men smashed a window with a rock. The congregation inside flinched at the noise, fear spreading like wildfire. Marcus emerged from the shed, his makeshift tools in hand. He moved quickly and quietly, positioning himself behind one of the trucks. The men closest to him were too focused on their destruction to notice his presence. He crept up behind them, his heart pounding in his chest. With one swift motion, he looped the rope around the ankles of the nearest man and yanked hard, sending him crashing to the ground. The other turned, startled, but Marcus was already on him, using the wooden plank to knock the spray can from his hand. The man stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear. "Who the hell?" he started, but Marcus cut him off, his voice low and commanding. "Quiet," Marcus said, "unless you want the rest of your crew to hear." The man froze, his hands raised in surrender. Marcus tied his hands with the rope, his movements efficient and practiced. The first man, still dazed from his fall, was similarly restrained. Marcus dragged them both into the shadows, out of sight from the rest of the gang. By now, Roy was growing impatient. He paced near the front steps, glancing toward the side of the church where the two men had been tagging the walls. "What's taking them so long?" he muttered. "Go check on them," he ordered another gang member. The man nodded and headed toward the side of the church, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Marcus watched him approach, his muscles tensing. He couldn't take them all out at once, but he could whittle them down, one by one. The gang member rounded the corner and stopped, his flashlight landing on the spray cans abandoned on the ground. "What the?" he started, but before he could finish, Marcus struck, grabbing him from behind and covering his mouth to muffle his shout. Within moments, he was restrained and added to the growing collection of subdued attackers. Marcus knew his time was running out. The gang would soon realize something was wrong, and they wouldn't hesitate to escalate their attack. He needed to draw their attention away from the church and its occupants. With a deep breath, he picked up a discarded piece of metal and hurled it toward the far side of the lot, where it clattered loudly against a stack of old barrels. The noise had the desired effect. Roy and the remaining men turned toward the sound, their weapons drawn. "Who's out there?" Roy called, his voice echoing across the lot. For the first time that night, uncertainty crept into his tone. The metallic clatter echoed in the still night, drawing the attention of the gang like a moth to a flame. Roy's flashlight beam swept across the lot, searching for the source of the noise. His crew fanned out behind him, their movements cautious now, their earlier confidence replaced with unease. Something wasn't adding up, and Roy could feel the shift in the air. "Stay sharp," he ordered, his voice lower than before but still firm. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but the thought that someone might be out there, watching, waiting, gnawed at the edge of his composure. Marcus stayed hidden in the shadows, his breathing steady as he observed the gang's movements. His plan was simple: divide and conquer. He couldn't let them regroup or focus their attention back on the church. The more distracted they were, the better chance the congregation had to remain safe. From his vantage point, Marcus caught a glimpse of the church windows. Inside, the flickering candlelight illuminated the worried faces of the congregation. He could see the pastor pacing near the pulpit, speaking softly to a few of the older men, likely trying to formulate a plan to protect everyone. But Marcus knew they were outmatched. These were ordinary people, not fighters. If it came down to confrontation, they wouldn't stand a chance. Roy's second in command, a wiry man named Daryl, gestured toward the far side of the lot. "Could be someone messing with us," he muttered, his tone skeptical. "Maybe one of those church folks trying to scare us off." Roy sneered at the suggestion. "Church folks don't have the guts for this," he shot back, but even as he spoke, doubt flickered in his eyes. He motioned for two more of his men to check the barrels where the noise had come from. Marcus used the opportunity to circle around the lot, keeping to the shadows. His mind raced as he calculated his next move. He needed to buy more time and keep the gang from realizing just how outnumbered they were becoming. If they discovered their missing men too soon, the situation could spiral out of control. As the two gang members approached the barrels, Marcus struck again. This time, he used the element of surprise to his full advantage, taking out the first man with a swift, silent maneuver that left him unconscious. The second man turned just in time to catch a glimpse of Marcus before he was subdued, his flashlight clattering to the ground. Marcus dragged them both into the shadows, adding them to the growing pile of restrained attackers. Roy and the remaining men were now visibly on edge. The gang's numbers were dwindling, though they didn't yet realize it. Roy's frustration boiled over, and he kicked at the dirt, his temper flaring. "Where the hell is everybody?" he snapped. "They've been gone too long." Daryl stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "Something's not right, Roy. Maybe we should call it a night." Roy whipped around, his face contorted with anger. "Call it a night? Are you kidding me? This place is supposed to be afraid of us, not the other way around." He jabbed a finger toward the church. "We finish what we started. No one's going to stop us." But even as he spoke, his bravado rang hollow. The gang members exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence eroding with each passing minute. They were tough, sure, but they weren't prepared for whatever, or whoever, they were up against. Inside the church, the tension was just as high. The pastor had finally convinced a few of the younger men to barricade the doors with whatever they could find. Pews were dragged into position, and heavy wooden boards were nailed across the entrances. The sound of hammering echoed through the sanctuary, mingling with the quiet murmurs of prayer. One of the older women, a widow named Mrs. Carter, clutched her Bible tightly and whispered to the pastor, "Do you think they'll hurt us?" Her voice was shaky, her eyes wide with fear. The pastor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're in God's house, Mrs. Carter. We have to trust that He'll protect us." But even as he spoke the words, his gaze flickered toward the windows, his expression betraying his own uncertainty. Marcus knew he couldn't keep this up forever. He needed to confront Roy directly and end this before things spiraled further out of control. But Roy wasn't just any gang leader. He was unpredictable, dangerous, and desperate to assert his dominance. Taking him down wouldn't be easy. Marcus moved closer to the center of the lot, his footsteps silent. He positioned himself near one of the trucks, waiting for the right moment to make his move. As Roy barked more orders, Marcus could see the cracks in his leadership. The gang was growing restless, their fear outweighing their loyalty. Darrell approached Roy again, his voice lowered so the others couldn't hear. "Roy, this isn't working. Something's out there, picking us off one by one. We don't know what we're dealing with." Roy spun on him, his eyes blazing. "What we're dealing with is a bunch of cowards hiding in the dark," he growled. "And if you're scared, Darrell, maybe you shouldn't be here." Darrell bristled at the insult but didn't respond. He looked around the lot, his unease evident. The gang wasn't used to being on the defensive, and it showed. They had always relied on intimidation and numbers to get their way, but tonight their tactics were failing them. Marcus saw his chance. Stepping out of the shadows, he called out, his voice calm but firm, "Roy Hatcher." The gang froze, their flashlights swinging toward the sound. Roy turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the source of the voice. Marcus stepped into the light, his face impassive, but his presence commanding. "Who the hell are you?" Roy demanded, his voice sharp with both anger and uncertainty. Marcus didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, using it to his advantage. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured and deliberate. "You've already lost more men than you realize," he said. "You're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of your depth." Roy scoffed, though the bravado in his voice was clearly forced. "Big talk for one guy against all of us." Marcus took a step closer, his eyes locked on Roy's. "You think this is about numbers? This is about choices. And you've made the wrong ones tonight." The gang shifted uneasily, their flashlights darting around, as if expecting more attackers to emerge from the darkness. The atmosphere crackled with tension, the confrontation teetering on the edge of violence. Roy clenched his fists, his pride and rage battling against the growing realization that he might not be in control anymore. "You don't scare me," he spat. But his voice wavered ever so slightly. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. The game had shifted, and Roy Hatcher was no longer holding the cards. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of uncertainty and fear. Marcus stood his ground, his gaze unwavering as Roy glared at him, trying to project the dominance he'd so easily wielded over others. But this wasn't the same. Roy could feel it. The man standing before him wasn't intimidated, wasn't backing down. That alone was enough to unsettle him, though he wouldn't dare show it to his crew. "What's your game, huh?" Roy barked, trying to regain control of the situation. "Think you're some kind of hero. This isn't your fight, so why do we walk away while you still can?" Marcus didn't flinch. He could see through Roy's facade, the cracks in his bravado growing wider with each passing second. This was no fearless leader. This was a man desperate to hold onto power, terrified of losing the control he'd built his entire reputation on. "My fight," Marcus replied evenly. "You made it mine the moment you brought your hatred here. You think fear makes you powerful, but tonight you're going to find out what real strength looks like." Roy's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. His crew looked on, their eyes darting nervously between Marcus and their leader. The unease was palpable now, the gang's earlier bravado replaced with hesitation. One of them shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening on the baseball bat he carried, as if holding onto it might give him some sense of control. Inside the church, the congregation was silent, their prayers and whispered conversations coming to an abrupt halt as they heard the voices outside. The pastor moved toward the window, carefully peeking through the edge of the curtain. His heart sank when he saw Marcus standing alone in the middle of the lot, surrounded by the gang. What was he doing out there? Who was he? The pastor had noticed him sitting quietly in the back of the church earlier, but now, it was clear the stranger wasn't just an ordinary visitor. Roy took a step forward, his flashlight beam catching Marcus's face. "You got a lot of nerve, coming out here alone. But you're not walking away from this. I don't care who you think you are." Marcus allowed himself the faintest of smiles, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You're not the first to make that mistake," he said quietly. "But let me ask you something, Roy. How many of your men are you willing to lose tonight? Because I promise you, none of them are ready for what's coming." The threat hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Roy hesitated, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. He glanced over his shoulder at his crew, some of whom were now visibly uneasy. The realization was beginning to dawn on them. They were not in control of this situation. But Roy wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't allow it. He couldn't afford to look weak in front of his men, not when his entire reputation depended on it. Gritting his teeth, he pointed a finger at Marcus. "You think you can scare me with talk? Let's see what you're really made of." With a quick motion, he gestured for two of his men to advance. They hesitated, looking at each other nervously before stepping forward. One held a metal pipe, the other a chain, their movements uncertain but fueled by the pressure to obey Roy's command. Marcus didn't move, his stance calm and collected. He watched as they approached, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. When they were within striking distance, the first man swung his pipe with a grunt, aiming for Marcus's head. But Marcus moved like water, fluid and precise. He ducked under the swing, twisting his body to avoid the chain as the second man lashed out. In the blink of an eye, Marcus grabbed the chain, yanking it with such force that the man stumbled forward, losing his balance. The next few seconds were a blur of calculated movements. Marcus disarmed the first man with a swift kick to the wrist, sending the pipe clattering to the ground. He used the chain to disable the second, wrapping it around the man's arm and pulling him off balance before delivering a clean strike to his shoulder. Both men hit the ground, groaning in pain, their weapons now in Marcus's control. The rest of the gang froze, their faces pale with shock. Roy's confidence wavered, his bravado replaced by a flicker of panic. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him. Marcus straightened, tossing the chain to the side and stepping over the fallen men. His eyes locked onto Roy's, his voice low but firm. "You can still stop this, Roy. Take your men and leave. Or keep going, and I'll finish what you started." The challenge hung in the air, daring Roy to make his choice. The gang leader's mind raced, torn between retreating and saving face. His pride screamed at him to fight, to prove he wasn't afraid, but the cold reality of the situation was impossible to ignore. "You don't know who you're messing with," Roy said, his voice shaky now, lacking the conviction it had held earlier. Marcus took a step closer, his presence imposing, his voice steady. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The question is, do you?" For a moment, the lot was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The gang shifted uneasily, their loyalty to Roy now hanging by a thread. The balance of power had shifted completely, and everyone could feel it. Inside the church, the congregation watched in stunned silence. The pastor stood by the window, his hands pressed together in prayer, though he couldn't take his eyes off the scene unfolding outside. The stranger, this Marcus, had somehow turned the tide, but would it be enough? As the seconds ticked by, Roy's resolve faltered. His grip on his crew was slipping, and he knew it. But before he could make his next move, Marcus spoke again, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Last chance, Roy. Walk away. And for the first time, Roy hesitated. Roy's hesitation hung in the air, an unspoken admission that the control he once wielded was slipping through his fingers. His gang stood frozen, watching him for a decision, but the doubt in their eyes was clear. For the first time, they weren't sure if Roy was the leader they thought he was, and Roy could feel it. It was like a slow unraveling, and every second of his silence only tightened the noose around his authority. Just as it seemed he might back down, a faint sound broke through the tense stillness. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it grew steadily louder. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching from the edge of the lot. Marcus turned slightly, his sharp instincts bristling. Whoever was coming wasn't part of the congregation. From the shadows emerged a tall, broad-shouldered figure dressed in dark clothing. The man's face was partially obscured by the brim of a hat, but his confident stride and the glint of something metallic at his side made it clear he wasn't here by accident. The gang shifted uneasily, their nerves already frayed. Roy's face lit up, a mix of relief and triumph washing over him. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice regaining some of its edge. "Looks like you're not the only one with backup." The man stopped a few feet away from Roy, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He seemed unfazed by the tension, his expression unreadable. "You call me for this?" he asked flatly, his deep voice cutting through the air like a knife. Roy smirked, gesturing toward Marcus. "This guy's been playing hero, messing with my crew. Figured you'd want to handle it." The newcomer didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied Marcus with a cold, calculating stare. Marcus held his ground, his posture steady, but he could sense the shift. This man wasn't like the others. He wasn't just muscle following orders. There was something deliberate about him, something dangerous. "You've been busy," the man finally said, addressing Marcus directly. His tone wasn't accusatory, but there was a weight to his words, as though he was sizing Marcus up, trying to unravel his motives. Marcus stayed silent, letting the man make the next move. He wasn't about to give away more than he needed to, especially not to someone who clearly posed a new kind of threat. The man glanced back at Roy, his expression neutral. "You didn't tell me you were losing men," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of disapproval. Roy bristled, his pride wounded. "We're not losing," he snapped. "This guy's just got some tricks up his sleeve, that's all, but with you here, it's over." The man raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Is it?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. Marcus could feel the tension rising, the situation growing more volatile by the second. This wasn't just about the gang anymore. This man had his own agenda, and Marcus wasn't sure what role he played or how far he was willing to go. Inside the church, the congregation watched with bated breath. The pastor's hands were clenched tightly around his Bible, his knuckles white. He whispered a quiet prayer under his breath, his heart pounding. Whatever was happening out there, it felt like the calm before a storm. The man turned his attention back to Marcus, his gaze sharp. "I've seen your kind before," he said, his tone even. "Think you can step in, play the hero, and walk away unscathed. But you don't know what you've walked into." Marcus narrowed his eyes, his instincts on high alert. "Maybe you don't know what you've walked into," he countered, his voice steady but laced with warning. The man smirked, a cold, humorless expression. "We'll see about that." Before Marcus could respond, the man reached for his side, pulling out a sleek, compact device. It wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional sense, but its purpose was clear as he activated it. A sharp, high-pitched sound filled the air, piercing and relentless. Marcus winced, his senses overwhelmed for a split second, but he quickly adjusted, his training kicking in. The gang, however, wasn't so lucky. Several of them dropped their weapons, clutching their ears in pain. Roy shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the noise. The congregation inside the church scrambled to cover their ears, the sound penetrating the walls and windows. Marcus realized this was no ordinary attack. The sound was designed to disorient, to create chaos. And in the confusion, the man made his move, lunging toward Marcus with surprising speed. Marcus dodged just in time, the man's strike grazing past him. The two engaged in a swift, brutal exchange, their movements precise and calculated. It was clear the man was highly trained, his skills rivaling Marcus's own. For the first time that night, Marcus felt the weight of a true challenge. This wasn't about outsmarting a group of thugs. This was a fight for survival against someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Roy watched from the sidelines, a twisted grin on his face. He could feel the tide turning in his favor. "That's right," he shouted. "Show him who's boss." But even as the fight raged on, Marcus noticed something. The man wasn't fighting to win, at least not in the traditional sense. His strikes were controlled, his movements deliberate, as though he was testing Marcus rather than trying to defeat him outright. And then it clicked. This wasn't just about taking Marcus down. This was about sending a message. As the realization hit, Marcus knew he had to change his approach. This fight wasn't just about strength, it was about strategy. And if he didn't figure it out soon, the stakes would rise far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The clash between Marcus and the mysterious man reached a fever pitch, their movements a blur of calculated strikes and counters. Every punch, every block, every pivot spoke volumes about their respective training. The man's attacks were relentless, but Marcus was more than prepared. He had faced challenges far greater than this, situations where a single misstep meant death. Yet, something about this fight felt different. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The man's precision wasn't just about testing Marcus. It was a statement, one that hinted at a deeper game being played. Roy watched from a safe distance, his smug grin faltering as Marcus held his own. The gang, still recovering from the disorienting sound wave, stayed rooted in place, too wary to intervene. Inside the church, the congregation remained huddled together, their whispered prayers filling the air as they watched through the windows, hearts pounding. The pastor stood at the front, his eyes fixed on the scene, unable to look away. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Marcus shifted the momentum. He feinted to the right, drawing the man into an overextended attack, and then spun to deliver a sharp blow to his opponent's ribs. The man staggered, his breath hitching, but he recovered quickly, his face betraying only the faintest flicker of pain. For a moment, they locked eyes, and Marcus saw something he hadn't expected: respect. "You're good," the man said, his voice steady despite the strain. "Better than I thought." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes, a quiet acknowledgement of the mutual respect shared between warriors. But he also knew that this fight couldn't drag on. The stakes were too high, and every second wasted put the people inside the church in greater danger. The man adjusted his stance, preparing for another round, but before he could move, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Everyone froze. It wasn't Marcus or the man who had made the sound. It was Roy. He stepped forward, his confidence newly emboldened as he held something in his hand. It was small, metallic, and unmistakably dangerous. "Enough of this," Roy shouted, his voice echoing across the lot. "I'm done waiting for you to finish him. I'll take care of it myself." Marcus's eyes flicked to the device in Roy's hand. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, but it was no less deadly. A small red light blinked ominously on its side, and Marcus recognized it instantly. It was a remote detonator. Roy laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "You really thought you were in control, didn't you? You thought you could just walk in here and stop us? Well, guess what? You've already lost." Marcus's mind raced, piecing together what Roy meant. Somewhere nearby, there was a bomb, and Roy was holding the trigger. The weight of the revelation hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about scaring the church into submission. This was about destruction on a massive scale. The man who had been fighting Marcus turned to Roy, his expression darkening. "What are you doing?" he demanded. This wasn't part of the plan. Roy sneered. "Plans change. You wanted to test him? Fine, but I'm ending this my way." The tension shifted again, this time more volatile than ever. Marcus saw his chance, using the momentary distraction to close the distance between himself and Roy. But Roy was faster than expected, his thumb hovering over the detonator's button. "Don't take another step," Roy barked, his voice trembling slightly. "I'll do it. Don't think I won't." Marcus stopped, his hands raised slightly, his mind working furiously to find a solution. Behind him, the man who had been his opponent seemed equally torn, his allegiance to Roy clearly wavering. The gang stood in stunned silence, their earlier bravado reduced to fear and confusion. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said calmly, his voice steady despite the tension. "You think this will make you powerful? All it'll do is destroy you." Roy's grip tightened on the detonator. "You don't get it, do you? This is about sending a message. They need to know we're not afraid." "They already know," Marcus said, taking a careful step forward. "You've made your point. But this isn't power, it's fear. And when it's over, all you'll have left is regret." For a moment, it seemed like Marcus's words might have reached Roy. His hand trembled, the detonator wavering slightly. But just as hope began to bloom, Roy's face hardened. He pressed his thumb down. The sound of the button clicking was deafening, but nothing happened. Roy froze, his confidence shattering as he looked down at the device in his hand. The red light had gone dark. "It's over, Roy," the man who had fought Marcus said, stepping forward. He held a small device in his hand, its blinking blue light a stark contrast to the extinguished red. "I disabled it." Roy's face twisted in fury. You betrayed me?" The man's expression was cold. "This was never about destroying lives. You crossed a line." Before Roy could respond, Marcus moved. In one fluid motion, he disarmed Roy, knocking the detonator from his hand and sending him to the ground. The gang, seeing their leader defeated, scattered into the night, their loyalty crumbling in the face of chaos. The man who had disabled the bomb turned to Marcus. "I don't agree with what he's done," he said quietly, "but this isn't over." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "Then we'll deal with it when the time comes." The man nodded once, then disappeared into the shadows, leaving Marcus standing alone in the lot. Inside the church, the congregation erupted into cheers, their relief palpable. But Marcus didn't celebrate. He knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. And somewhere in the distance, the storm was still brewing.